What? What? What even is this? Fine. Ah, literature, food for the brain. Books are one of the most widely used mediums that us humans use on a daily basis, whether it be a piece of fiction, a textbook, or even a menu. Even though we have since developed new ways of recording the same information without the use of paper, I'd say the main idea has stayed the same. But Ponyland doesn't have much in the way of digitalization as far as I know. In Equestria, we know that books exist and are used a lot. They have comic books, sheet music, newspapers, scrolls, menus, and just the average book. But when it comes to the typical book, they especially care. They construct weird areas for holding them. Yes, they too have libraries as we do. The libraries are all over the place. The Crystal Empire has a pretty good sized one, Camelot contains one of the royal variety, and of course our home base Ponyville has a nice... had a nice one. Oh, but they got a new one in the Turd Castle, so that's good. In these libraries, their books have variety as well. We know that they have fiction, as shown by the Daring Do Wait, those actually happened. I guess they're actually historical books? Well, what about that storybook that keeps popping up? You know, the one that tells about the Mare and the Moon? No, that one was true too. Huh. Even in our world, almost every fictional tale has to take some things from reality, but the line in Equestria seems to be somewhat thin and blurred. Considering how history and fiction is recorded, the two seem to get mixed a lot. This might be dangerous for them. You wouldn't want fools reading something in a book and then getting into trouble with it. You know, like learning how to bend minds or something. This isn't really something I ever thought about until recently, but I mean, come on. You'd think they could have developed some Dewey Decimal System to differentiate fact from fiction. Get on it, Twilight! Really, I think the reason stories in Equestria are based so heavily on their real world is simply because their world is basically a storybook. They live in a world populated by magic talking horses where they deal with all kinds of creatures of the mythical variety. When flying and levitation is commonplace, it might be a little hard to try to make something more exciting in a creative way. Of course, this only occurs because MLP itself is a TV show to us, but it just kinda gives me a sense of joy to know that my fiction is better than my fiction's fiction. But while we're on this topic, I'd like to bring back up that storybook. It has been brought out on multiple occasions. Its most notable appearance, I'd say, is the first one ever presented to us. Yes, this book opened up the pilots to the show I Have Become Entangled So. It first told us the Mare and the Moon story that was believed by most ponies to be, quote, an old mare's tale. But we know it's much more. Later, other magical antagonists get introduced in the same fashion, and we are to believe them to be true as well. But if the one about Luna was considered to be fake, are the rest also thought to be myths? Has a historical book of villains been turned into just simple legends? From what we've seen, yes. I would think by now that they would recognize them to be factual, but honestly I'm pretty content with it just being a simple way to introduce a baddie. Now that that has been covered, I'd like to add that while I have painted Equestria as a land who can't come up with original stories, that was probably a slight exaggeration. I'm sure that among the many untitled books we've seen strewn about, many a story have been quite original and creative. One set of stories we've seen and I think is interesting is The Power Ponies. It is a comic book that is, for now, considered to be, indeed, made up. It describes the crime-fighting adventures of superheroes, which honestly doesn't seem very weird given the context. I wonder if the mysterious Mare-Duel persona was inspired by this story though, or considering that we saw the comics after that, vice versa. Either way, it would be an interesting idea, although I don't know who inspired the guy who enchanted one to put people into the story. Yeah, some pony took this saying literally and enchanted one of the comic books that coincidentally found its way to our main cast. It seems that books can and have been shown to be enchantment bait in MOP. The comic book was one for sure, and another one that I thought may be is the Inspiration Manifestation Spellbook, as it originally was shown to look like it had an impact on rarity. But that could have just simply been the spell. You know, actually, maybe it was just a spell that did the comic book too, as Spike had to read that little passage for it to activate. It seems that just simply reciting the spell seems to activate it. An example would be Star Swirl's unfinished spell that was simply written, but was immediately cast when Twilight recited it. Mentioning that spell reminds me how much books are used to continue the plot of this show too. They tend to always use books as the solution or the key to their answers, or in that specific case, the catalyst for them. At first glance it might be cheap, but hey, that's the joys of having a librarian protagonist. Also, it could potentially be a subtle knowledge is power message, but that's kind of boring. Okay, I'm gonna interject for a sec, because I've so far been rambling about books and a cartoon, and I wanted to have a nice clear way of wrapping up my thoughts together so that it all comes together. But since I'm not an author, I'm just going to get to my vague point. When I was sitting around trying to think of a topic, out of nowhere books popped into my mind, and at that moment I had realized that books play a massive role in the show. Of course, this kind of makes sense given the nature of the protagonist, as I said earlier, and based on how commonplace books are in our own world. But I thought that there must be more there, and I'm gonna stretch for it. Books, in the most part, represent information, ideas, thought. The show itself is based around the idea of learning, mainly about friendship, but still learning. And honestly, I think it does a pretty okay job, even if it can slip a little sometimes with its lessons. Either way, I find it fitting that books take such a prominent role in it. It stands almost as a symbol of the learning that we, and the characters, partake in on the journey through the show. Of course, it could be just a coincidence, or maybe I make a connection that isn't really there. Whether or not, I think it's still important to point out that we are blessed with such knowledge that we have. We have so much data and information at our fingertips. It just makes me wonder what Twilight would be able to do if she had a computer with internet. I just know she would nerd out with excitement over how much she could learn. We honestly take our knowledge for granted, and I think it's wise to keep in mind how lucky we are to be able to learn how to solve equations, research history, and even watch a show about ponies, all from the comfort of a screen. I advise you to think about that next time you see one of those silly book things that old people are always talking about, and think about what they truly did for mankind. And ponies. Always remember the ponies. I got a little ranty at the end, but I stand by it. Tell me what you think about books in the actual show, or about what they mean to the story in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want to see more. I upload whenever I'm not being a lazy idiot. I'm Flink Hollow, and remember, I put the anal into analysis.
You want weapons? We're in a library. Books! Best weapons in the world. This room's the greatest arsenal we could have.